MEI Cyber Program. Thank you so much for joining us today. I focus on issues related to technology and human rights at the MEI Cyber Program, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to our panel discussion, which is entitled Digital Occupation, the Implications of Media Moderation in Palestine. As the international community has further opened its eyes to the dangerous patterns of censorship and discrimination against Palestinians and Palestinian narratives online, narratives that have been documented by human rights organizations, journalists, and advocates for years, particularly on social media platforms, many have called for legislative reform, policy changes at the company level, more attention to the needs and concerns of Palestinians, and on the part of stakeholders in the technology industry. While some limited partnerships and reforms have made progress in this issue, there's still an enormous gulf in the area of policy responses to the problem of online discrimination against Palestinians and censorship online more broadly. So the questions that we have for today are sort of, what are the implications for this phenomenon? And what are some potential policy steps for social media companies, governments, states, and other civil society organizations to start taking steps that might address this challenge in a more holistic and long-term way instead of kind of slapping band-aids on what is definitely a systemic problem? This is a second in a series of webinars that are examining this issue. And if you're interested to check out the first series, please go ahead and check that out on the MEI events page. It was hosted about 2 weeks ago. I'm really pleased to welcome our three excellent panelists who are going to help us talk through some of these tricky questions. So first we have Radhika Seneth, who is a senior staff attorney at Palestine Legal. She oversees the organization's casebook on free speech, censorship, and academic freedom. Before Palestine Legal, Radhika successfully represented clients at a California civil rights firm for cases involving discrimination, human rights abuses, and prison conditions. And she's a contributor to outlets like MSNBC, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera English, and the New York Times. And her writing has appeared in The Nation, Jacobin, and Literary Hub. Next, we have Mona Shtaya, who is a digital rights defender working in the Arab region. She's currently the local advocacy manager at Hamle, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, and she joined Hamle in 2017 as an advisory board member. Mona has previously worked in the field of communications and campaigns with several civil society organizations, and she was the community outreach coordinator of Transparency Palestine, the national chapter of Transparency International. And I'm also pleased to welcome Ashraf Zeytoun, who's an advisor and investor and the founding partner at Confidential, as well as the former director of public policy for Middle East, Turkey, and North Africa at Netflix. In addition to this, he was the former advisor to the head of policy at Hub 71, the managing partner and chief ideation officer for public policy at Diplomacy Labs, and previously head of public policy for the Middle East and North Africa at Facebook. So he brings a very rich set of perspectives from that perspective. So to start off, I kind of want to get first reactions from each of you in your respective sort of spheres of specialization about the past month and about the escalation in violence in Gaza and the occupied territories and the subsequent kind of, I guess, realization on the part of many, U.S. policymakers that this censorship had been taking place for as long as it did, and how critical it was that this be addressed, particularly since social media sort of became the area where it became possible to see a clearer and kind of more direct view of what was going on the ground in Palestine. So can you speak more to the experience of the past month and sort of how you see this in the lens of digital activism and digital witnessing online? And I'll start with you, Radhika.
Sure. Thanks for that introduction. And I'm so excited to be here, especially with Mona and Ashraf, who I think are real experts here on this issue. Just a little bit about Palestine Legal for those who don't know who we are, what we do. So we're a US-based nonprofit. We're basically the legal arm of the movement for Palestinian rights in the United States. We have a staff of 9 with 5 attorneys. I'm based in New York City. And we basically, if an activist, if a student, a professor is censored or punished, or falsely accused for speaking out for Palestinian rights, we have their backs. We provide legal advice, we hook them up with attorneys, and we answer their legal questions and try to make it so that they are able to speak out on Palestinian freedom. And so we advise people in all 50 states. So our offices are in New York, Chicago, and the Bay Area, and I'm based in New York City. And so, we're a small office. We started in 2013. And one of the things that we also do is we track incidents of censorship um, for people who are speaking out for Palestinian freedom. And so I just want to say, absolutely, we have seen a huge uptick in censorship in the past month, but this is not something that is new. And it's not something that is just restricted or limited to social media or online or digital censorship. Since 2014, between 2014 and December 2020, we responded to over 1,700 incidents of censorship in the United States. And that's in all areas, everything from professors who have been fired for speaking out on criticizing Israel's bombing of Gaza that happened in 2014. People who've had their classes canceled because they analyze Zionism as a settler colonial ideology. People who've been falsely accused, FBI visits, students who have had to go through onerous disciplinary processes, again, just for speaking up for Palestinian freedom. So we've seen a whole sort of slew of types of cases. But one thing that we've really seen in the past month, particularly, of course, and this is what the talk is about, is of course censorship as far as big tech goes, and also apps like Venmo and other areas of online censorship. And I'm going to let Mona and Ashraf talk more about that, because I think they're the real experts here. And when people do come to us, and we have had so many people come to us recently, talking about how they see a post on Facebook saying all Palestinians are terrorists. And then they respond by saying, no, Israel, what Israel is doing, that's real terrorism. And then they see that they're being blocked by Facebook, but Facebook is not blocking the original post calling Palestinians terrorists. So, that's obviously a problem. And when people come to us, we actually refer them to Humble. But we try to help them as well. But the other aspect of things that we're actually really seeing right now in the past month is a rise in sort of just I want to call them just regular people. So people who aren't necessarily activists, or who maybe didn't know that much about Israel's the occupation or the Nakba or any of these different types of things. And then all of a sudden they're seeing what's happening with the ethnic cleansing, with the bombing in Gaza. And they're really upset about this, and they're working in all aspects of life. So it could be a doctor or a therapist or a farmer or a journalist or a lawyer, a teacher, what have you. And they've noticed that their employers have made other social justice statements in the past. So for example, here in the United States, a lot of people condemned the killing of African Americans in the wake of George Floyd's murder, right? And there was uprisings last summer, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of people, a lot of employers and other people spoke out against the killing of Black lives. Similarly, in the wake of an anti-Asian hate crime here in Atlanta in the spring, you saw a lot of people speaking out against anti-Asian hate as well in the United States. So I think a lot of people saw their employers doing this kind of thing, or saw their fellow coworkers speaking out against racism and hate. And then they did the same thing with Palestinians, condemning Israel's killing of Palestinians, often, killing Palestinian children. And then all of a sudden they're called in, they're reprimanded by their employer, they're punished, they're threatened with losing their jobs. So we've been seeing a lot of this right now, and it's what we call, we put a report out on this. It's called the Palestine Exception to free speech. Just how, people who speak out for Palestinian rights are often treated really differently because they're speaking out for Palestinian freedom, and how problematic this is. And I just want to emphasize, obviously, it's not just people who are speaking out for Palestinian rights who are censored here. There's been other types of problematic behavior, and we're seeing that right now with a professor, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was who didn't get tenure at the University of North Carolina because of her scholarship on slavery. So it's not just unique to Palestine, but we are really seeing this in a really pronounced way when it comes to people who are speaking out for Palestinian freedom.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate that you kind of brought this larger, kind of zoomed out lens, Because again, we have to understand, and unfortunately, in some of the ways that the US media has reported on this incident, it's been treated as kind of coming out of nowhere or like this new phenomenon, when in reality, it's an extension of ongoing patterns in other sectors, and it's just the online extension of some of it. So let's go to Mona next to kind of get your take on the last month and sort of where you see things headed.
Thanks, Elise. So we usually start defining the digital rights as an extension for human rights in the online space. And this is exactly what we have seen over the past month. We have seen an escalation against Palestinians in the offline world. I mean, on the ground, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, and Gaza Strip, and even in West Bank, and even against Palestinian citizens of Israel. And as this escalation was going on the ground, we have also observed an escalation or attack against Palestinian digital rights on the internet. And because of that, we were working to document these cases. I mean, not only the cases of content censorship, but also other kind of digital rights violations. We can talk about various and in a numerous number of digital rights violations that Palestinians were exposed to over the past month. I would start with the content censorship that came from the tech companies, specifically from the social media companies such as Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and also TikTok. On the other hand, we have observed other kind of digital rights violations that was threatening Palestinians, such as when the Israeli intelligence service was sending SMSs for worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque, telling them that you have been in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and this is or you are participating in a violent work, and because of that we will hold you accountable later. And it was signed by the Israeli intelligence services, and they were intimating, they were using GPS to track people, and they are violating their privacy by doing so. And by doing this, they are also threatening them and intimating them to be held accountable later. So by doing that, they mean to prevent Palestinians from going out to the streets. The Israeli intelligence service also was calling Palestinians and asking them not to post the documentation of human rights violations on the social media and on the internet. And this is like also kind of threatening them and intimidating them. It's like a policy of fear they were trying to use against Palestinians to silence Palestinians. In a way, they are trying to silence Palestinians and to prevent spreading our narrative and also our stories on the online space. Much more than that, we have observed many other kinds of violations, like Radhika said. She talked about Venmo, but we also observed other kinds of violations with Google Maps, for example. They were not updating their maps. Gaza Strip was looking like blur. No one can know which building was bombed and which building is still it is still not bombed there. And by doing that, they are preventing human rights defenders and the human rights organizations from investigating and knowing what's happening on the ground. And because of that, this is also part of the Google Maps violations against Palestinians, because earlier last year or 2 years ago, we have published a specialized report on Google Maps where they are hiding the marginalized and unrecognized Palestinian villages that is unrecognized by Israel under many layers. You have to zoom several times to find these marginalized villages, while you can see the illegal Israeli settlement at the top of their layers without zooming in and without pointing that this is an illegal Israeli settlement. You can't see any kind of checkpoints on Google Maps, and by doing so, they are violating the international law. They are also not they are not reflecting what's happening on the ground. They are not reflecting the reality that we are living in Palestine. We have also seen many other kind of violations over the past month, but maybe we can discuss that later, especially with the content censorship. So now I leave the floor to you and to Ashraf to continue, and we will dive into details later on.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great introduction. So it's interesting. I mean, I might even think of it a little bit as sort of like digital checkpoints, I guess, that there's like extra friction sometimes. for users who are writing from a Palestinian perspective to have, to arrive at their destination of expressing their content or whatever it is. So Ashraf, I'd love to hear from you, and maybe if you can speak a little bit to this, and maybe if there's been discussion of this more broadly in Jordan where you are, or kind of the private sector perspective on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Elisa, for the introduction. So I think a couple of points that I think it's worth iterating for our audience is what we're seeing here is not something new. Where it's not a new trend or a new pattern. What we're seeing, this whole latest spate of content takedown, is just part of a wider pattern that we've been observing for quite some time. And this is, I think, constitutes consistent censorship of Palestinians and the allied voices with them. And it's an effort, I think, spearheaded by the Israeli government with the direct cooperation of a lot of the tech companies to systematically silence Palestinians and to try to muffle down these voices. I think we've witnessed this significant volume due to the significant volume of content that has been created to support the Palestinian side, to provide a different narrative than what a lot of people have been hearing from the mainstream media. And I think this is what led to us witnessing this significant content takedown. So whatever we see, it's worth clarifying to a lot of people. From my experience, specifically with what's happening with the Palestinian content and Palestinian narrative, this all started in late 2016, and it has been growing since then. And I think it comes very closely associated with the growth of a Palestinian audience on social media platforms, in particular Facebook and Instagram. And that immediately alerted the Israeli government. And this is when you see a systematic approach in trying to connect with the tech companies, in trying to understand their rules and guidelines, and in trying as much as possible to lobby them and to advocate for new restrictions, new guidelines that will eventually censorship Palestinian narrative. What's, I think, clearly evident about what we saw lately was, I think, the volume of content by Palestinians, by allied voices is unprecedented. I've never seen anything to this level. And I think that led indirectly to us witnessing this unprecedented level of content takedown. What's also remarkable is we've seen the impact of that not limited to social media platforms. This has gone to search engines. This has gone to online payment solution. It has literally unmasked a lot of the efforts that have been taken by the Israeli government over the years to try as much as possible to either coerce, to lobby, or to try to an extent pressure a lot of the tech companies to try to an extent what you can consider a digital apartheid. They're trying to diminish a Palestinian narrative as if Palestinians, their digital rights don't exist, and that Palestinians don't deserve the same digital rights that all of us are practicing around the world.
Yeah, thank you again for this. I think it's really important to sort of center this in the larger context and to understand how it's part of something that's bigger and something that's been baked in to the operating systems of these companies from their inception, basically. So I want to go back to Radhika and just get back to this idea of the Palestine exception, which obviously, it's been said that this is sort of, everything but Palestine when it comes to progressive views or when it comes to human rights agendas. And I think there's been sort of a parallel of this idea in how content is policed online. And it's been reported on now that certain words, certain phrases, things like Zionist, things like Shaheed, have really kind of quixotic or complex patterns of takedowns or patterns of analysis on the part of a lot of companies, particularly Facebook, where there might be exceptions. Again, this idea of exceptions for when and how people who are Palestinian, people who are expressing solidarity with Palestinians are allowed to use certain words that maybe wouldn't exist. Can you kind of talk more about this Palestinian exception in the work that you do at Palestine Legal and kind of how it extends into this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a lot of talk here in the United States about sort of cancel culture, right? And it's sort of a hot term of phrase, especially for people on the right and also liberals. And it's never really used to talk about what some have called the real cancel culture, which is how people who speak out for Palestinian freedom are censored or punished, again, for taking a principled view on Palestinian rights. And so, we have seen sort of in recent years, well, there's a number of tactics to try to censor this speech. And, actually, I just want to take a minute to go back to something Ashraf actually said, which I think is really important, which is that, before we go so negative on the censorship, which is that, the reason this is happening is because there is this growing global movement for Palestinian rights, right? And here in the United States, I mean, our government actually, we know, has been pretty terrible and very one-sided in far as who it's supporting and who it's not supporting. But I think as far as the people, we really are seeing this growing movement. And it has been student-led in the past several years. And that makes sense, right? Here in the United States, like the anti-apartheid movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement have traditionally come out of student movements on college campuses. So, there is this growth in solidarity. It's not just limited to students. Right now you have like actors and models and sports, people, and pretty much, even politicians, every level of life, people are coming out to speak out against Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing and for Palestinian freedom. And because of this growth and support, we are seeing this censorship, right? And it's not just happening sort of on its own. It's happening because, you have anti-Palestinian groups that are really organizing and working to squelch speech supporting Palestinian rights, and also with the involvement of the state of Israel, right? The government itself. And Israel has allotted over 100 million to basically stop the boycott movement for Palestinian rights. And they are actually working with big tech, right, to censor people speaking up for Palestinian rights and Palestinians themselves. So, it's not a new thing. It's happening, across the board. But it is really problematic in a lot of different ways. And in one way in particular that I want to mention is because, because of the pandemic, right, universities completely shut down in the United States. I mean, high schools, everything, elementary schools, everything, right? And they moved to Zoom as a platform. And so you found that like Zoom is actually the new sort of virtual classroom, right? And here in the United States, we think of higher education as a place of like academic debate and discussion. If you're at a public university, you're protected by the First Amendment, which just means, you're supposed to be able to speak freely and not get censored based on your viewpoint, including your viewpoint supporting Palestinian freedom. But what we saw in the fall was a case where there was a course at SFSU, which involved, which was on a variety of different forms of resistance, and it included activists who were involved in the South Africa freedom struggle, anti-apartheid struggle, and different activists. And it also was to include a short talk by Leila Khalid as well. And Zoom censored it. They just pulled it, right? And then a few weeks later, a number of other professors at other universities did a solidarity sort of Zoom talk, talking about this issue of the Palestine Exception and how people who speak out for Palestinian rights are censored, including on universities. And there were 10 such talks across 10 universities. And I spoke at one of them at New York University. And it was to include a small clip by Leila Khalid again, talking about the history. You is a resistance icon, right? And you're supposed to be able to have these kinds of discussions on universities. And Zoom censored it. That one, a couple. So I think what we're really asking for here, as far as these companies, is really some transparency, right? What are your policies? How are they applied? What words are you using? What does Zionism mean? It is a political ideology, right? Criticizing Israel is criticizing a state, and everyone should be able to criticize states. Israel should not be exempt from criticism, just like, the United States government is not exempt from criticisms. But I think there's these attempts right now to try to conflate criticism of a state, criticism of Israel with criticism of Jews as a people, which is a different thing. Criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic. And I think, we're really seeing these attempts in sort of almost every area of life, but also in big tech, where the state of Israel and its staunchest supporters are trying to label criticism of Israel's anti-Semitism and try to get people to be censored in that way. And so I think it's really important as far as the policy initiative to make sure that there's clarity there and that that there isn't that conflation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I really appreciate you bringing in the history of student movements. And I hope that we get into this as well, because it does seem like, the online space these days is sort of where an idea that might have previously been thought of as extreme, something like being opposed to the Vietnam War, or something like being, for Palestinian rights, slowly becomes mainstream. And I think that's why partially the online space is so important. So Mona, I want to go to you. Hamle has been doing amazing reporting and amazing work in this space, and since its inception, but especially in the past couple of months. I encourage everyone listening today to go and check out some of the reporting. You put out a recent report today, or a couple days ago, that said that Hamle had documented 500 cases of digital rights violations between May 6th and May 19th, including on platforms that included Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Venmo, beyond. Can you speak a bit more about some of the patterns of discrimination that you've seen specifically in the past month, and especially some of the reasoning or some of the, justifications that companies have made, particularly with the example of conflating the Al-Aqsa Mosque with, terrorist content, for example. So what are some of the patterns in this discrimination that Hamle has reported on, and what do you think they say about the policy changes that are needed to move this forward?
Yeah, sure. So over the past years, we were working to influence these tech companies' policies, especially the social media companies. And we are talking about content moderation policies. Over the past month, we've seen this escalation and attack against Palestinian digital rights violations. I'll start talking about the content censorship. Over the past month, we have documented, if we are talking about the whole May, we have documented over 700 cases about content censorship, but between 6th of May and 19th of May, we have documented 500 cases. And these cases were on different platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and many other platforms. Half of them, 50% of them were on Instagram, where Instagram was taking down the content of people, suspend their accounts, and also taking down their archival stories that was taken down. What we noticed is that they were taking down the political content, specifically that document the human rights violations, the grave human rights violations that people are exposed to on the ground. Specifically at the first 2-3 days, it was related to Sheikh Jarrah and to the forced displacement there that people in Sheikh Jarrah were exposed to. And there was some strange cases that we have observed. One of them, for example, is someone who make a screenshot for her archive, and we found all her archive is still on. Only Sheikh Jarrah stories were taken down. Even it's in her archive, it's not online because it's live just for 24 hours. So this is like a grave violation, and it's a way to silence Palestinians and to take down our narrative and to censor our narrative and our stories. On the other hand, we have also observed around 35 cases, 35% of the cases were on Facebook, which is also the owner of Instagram. So we are talking about one company who owned Facebook, Instagram, and also WhatsApp, which also has closed and suspended many of the journalist accounts who were sharing the news about Hamas and about many other political parties and fractions during the attack. By doing so, the social media companies are not adapting the context, the Palestinian context. The Palestinian context is really messing with their digital or content moderation policies. For example, they are for example deleting everything related to Hamas. They don't know that sometimes we want to criticize Hamas, maybe not agreeing with them, or sometimes we are sharing the news. They are part of the Palestinian society, so sometimes we are sharing the news about Hamas, and by doing so, they are censoring our voices, and they are preventing us from sharing such stories or from sharing such criticizing, and they are creating self-censorship for Palestinians. So we are thinking hundreds times before posting anything on the social media platforms, even if it's criticizing for the Israeli government, or for Hamas, or for many other parties that were listed on the US terrorist list, because they adapt this list and they adapt something beyond that, because till now we are not sure what kind of list that they are dealing with, because the word shaheed, the word muqawama, which means resistance, and many other words are being censored. The content that include this kind of words is being taken down. We have also observed how they hid a specific hashtag, specifically Al-Aqsa hashtag, which was hid in, I think, 7th of May. And people were reporting to us because every piece of content that was posted on that hashtag was hidden. And yeah, the company have restored this kind of content, and they apologized, and they give us such excuses. They were talking about the global technical glitch. And this is like a very unconvincing, let's say, excuse, because how such excuses is only working for indigenous people in Colombia and also in Palestine and many other parts of the world, like Kashmir and Myanmar, how their content moderation policies are only working when it's coming to Palestinian voices and many other minor marginalized communities around the world. On the other hand, we were observing how Israelis were organizing and mobilizing themselves to share hate speech, racism, and also incitement against Palestinians. We were observing and documented how they use WhatsApp and Telegram to organize and mobilize themselves to attack Palestinians and Arabs in cities like Akka, Yafa, Haifa, and Diled. They were transforming this kind of online incitement to violence on the streets, and this is like nothing of this incitement conversations was censored or was taken down. Yesterday, we have published a new report that is talking about the incitement and how did racism and incitement against Palestinians and Arabs looks like between 6th of May and 21st of May. And we have observed that there is a 15th fold increase in a violent speech compared to the same time period last year. And this is like a huge jump toward incitement against Arabs and Palestinians. And we have seen how this kind of online incitement was transformed to a kind of violence against us on the streets, against Palestinians. We were killed, we were beaten on the streets, and also we were attacked from the Israeli settlers. And no one was taking down this kind of content. No one was censoring these voices, which are really violating the community standards of these social media companies. By the way, we were able to restore many cases of the cases that we have appealed to these social media companies. For example, we restored 96% of the cases that we have reported to Twitter. That means these cases were false positive and they are not violating their community standards. And the real content that is violating their community standards is still online, and some of it is from Israeli officials, like the Jerusalem mayor. He was clearly inciting against Palestinians in Jerusalem, inciting against them to be killed in the streets and to be shot, and no one has taken his content down. And by doing so, these content moderation policies are discriminatory policies. They are discriminating against Palestinians. And because of that, we were talking about the digital apartheid that we have seen. We are living on everyday basis, on a regular basis. So because of that, we are talking, I mean, this month was a great month that highlighted the digital rights violations that we are exposed to. But this is like part of an enormous digital rights violations that we are systematically exposed to. And we can't talk about this kind of violations without mentioning the Israeli cyber unit, which works systematically to report to the social media platforms to take down the Palestinian content. And over 20,000 cases where 20,000 requests were sent to social media companies in 2019 by the Israeli cyber unit. Ashraf mentioned 5 minutes ago that this escalation against Palestinian digital rights had started between 2015 and 2016. And this is the year exactly when the Israeli cyber unit was established. It was established in 2015. And because of that, they started censoring much more and more the Palestinian voices. And they are working systematically, not only through the Israeli cyber unit, because they have also other tools like the Gongo, which is governmental operated NGOs. They have this kind of platforms to ask Israelis and pro-Israelis around the world to report on the Palestinian content to be taken down and to spread much more the Israeli propaganda on the social media platforms. So we are talking about systematic efforts to silence Palestinians on the online spaces. And these social media companies, unfortunately, are complying the oppressive regimes and the oppressive governments request to silence marginalized people and marginalized communities' voices.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mona. I think that's a really, really great perspective and a really good overview of kind of the ins and outs of how this has been justified. And so turning to Ashraf, sort of as Mona noted, when it comes to, who to hold responsible or who to hold accountable, I think people are increasingly waking up to the fact that we're essentially forced to treat companies like Facebook, Twitter, these US-based, incredibly powerful, incredibly valued companies as governments that we didn't elect, that we didn't vote for. We have a question in the comments about the relatively newly established Facebook Oversight Board, which is also known as kind of like this Facebook Supreme Court. So I think they're basically going along with and kind of leaning into this idea that they're this information government right now. So Ashraf, I'm wondering, with the fact that these companies basically have a huge leverage and a huge amount of tone setting power when it comes to these kind of arbitrary decisions about what is allowed to stay up, what is, required taken down online. What does this mean more broadly for Palestinians in particular? And what are some global efforts to rein in big tech's overreach that might be more sensitive to the Palestinian case? And I hope that you are able to bring in some of your experience at Facebook to whatever extent you can, and kind of how we think about this discussion.
Thank you. I think when it comes to the first part of the question is what it means to the Palestinian, honestly, it's a tricky question because it's not an easy answer. A lot of people ask me what would be the natural response. My natural response would be to boycott that platform. But then if the Palestinian narrative is not there on these key social media platforms, that means you're leaving the space empty for the alternative narrative. So this is where it's a very difficult recommendation. And I've always told people, you need to be there despite all the censorship, despite all the restrictions. You need to be there because this is a battle of narratives. And over the last couple of years, the social media to an extent has given the Palestinians, has given minority causes around the world, one of the best weapons ever. But those were the early days. Things have changed now for multiple reasons. And again, we're Middle East Institute. Most of us are focused on the Palestinian cause. But I mean, this is very relevant to other causes around the world because what we have is a case of a government that's very sophisticated in cyber warfare that has been able to understand the system at one of the world's largest tech companies and been able to manipulate it and hack it to its benefit. So what prevents this from happening? And this is the case that's happening now with India. And what prevents it from happening with government X, government Y in their conflict with other minorities? So the big question mark for a lot of people to realize this is not an issue about only Palestine. This is an issue about a platform that's currently, when you think about Facebook and population of Facebook, you're talking about the world's largest population. And people assume that Facebook is a global tech company based in the US. People assume Facebook is a democracy. Facebook is not a democracy. Literally, you're sitting in a court, and especially when you mentioned the oversight board, it's literally the company decides whatever they want to do. The oversight board, in my opinion, is just a token structure that they tried to do it to just appease public opinion and tell people, look at what's happening. I dare for them to represent anything related to the cases that we felt to take it over to the oversight board. And just building on what Mona said, You had the head of the cyber warfare unit at the Israeli Ministry of Justice. That's part of the oversight board. So what kind of representation for Israel, a country of 10 million people, has one representative, and the Arab world, a population of 450 million, has also one representative? So how can you say about a just oversight board? I don't know, he didn't say that, but I mean, when people describe it, it's not an equal game. So I think the big challenge is whatever we need to focus and tell people, whatever we're facing here is not a Palestinian issue. Palestinian issue because it's relevant to us, because we're all passionate about it. It concerns us and everything. But we're seeing is abuse of power. And unfortunately, I think I don't expect any government in the Arab world, and I hate to say that, that will introduce legislation that will clamp down on Facebook's capabilities or regulate the sector. I think when we're talking about best case scenario, I would expect a European government to introduce legislation whereby someone who's not a resident or a citizen of that country could go and file a lawsuit against a global tech company for abuse of their of that person's digital rights in that country's jurisdiction. And I think honestly that's the best what we could do, because again, one other thing to look at, what we're facing now is we're talking about US tech companies, but soon we're going to be dealing with the same case with Chinese tech companies. And you're talking about two completely different cases with two completely different narrative and complex natures. I hate to say it, and I'm usually a very optimistic person. I don't see a way out of it anytime soon.
Yeah, thank you for that. I unfortunately am sort of in the same position myself right now. But I do think it's important to note that in many cases, Facebook itself is kind of the most widely used platform in a lot of the Middle East and, a lot of parts of the global South, has the most tone-setting power at this stage in some ways, because generally it seems like Facebook's decision-making and the way that it positions itself tends to get passed down to other tech companies as well. So I think at the very least, kind of becoming aware of that dynamic and sort of being honest with ourselves about the limitations of trying to ask for transparency is really critical to thinking about policy going forward. So I want to go back to Radhika and just to talk more about kind of the intersection between self-censorship and enforced censorship, particularly with the firing of AP journalist Emily Wilder, this really shocking move because of her past expressions with Palestinian solidarity and activism as a college student. And sort of, as you've noted in the case of Palestine Legal's work, this pressure, this professional pressure, academic pressure to avoid certain expressions of, solidarity or criticism of the Israeli government, and then how this intersects, or what are kind of the cross-border spaces where this intersects with outright censorship and kind of the power to delete that many of these companies have. And what are some ways that Palestine Legal is starting to approach this question from whether it's, in class action lawsuits or in, targeted legal work, and what are some ways to start thinking about ways to start kind of opening up this space for more dialogue and creating better outcomes?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Self-censorship, it's a huge problem as well. And frankly, anti-Palestinian groups have been really blunt in that being a goal, right? So one thing that just to give you an example, one thing that we've seen in the university context in the past few years is Zionist groups like the Brandeis Center filing complaints against universities saying, oh, if you allow a video like Occupation 101 or a talk with Nakba survivors and Holocaust survivors sharing experiences, or basically any speech criticizing Israel, that's in violation of discrimination laws. So they filed a whole bunch of these complaints, right? This was during the Obama years that this started. All of the complaints were dismissed. The Office for Civil Rights said, this is First Amendment protected speech, this is criticism of a state, this is not discrimination. So great decisions, right? But despite the fact that we technically won, the leader of this sort of strategy, Kenneth Marcus, who ended up going to the Trump administration, said, you know what, it might look like we're losing, but we're really not, because no one likes to be a target of a civil rights complaint. And people are not going to join Students for Justice in Palestine if they know that they're going to be subjected to these kinds of complaints. And I think in many ways, one could say that could be true. I think a lot of people are chilled from speaking out and are scared. I think I'm married to a professor, I should just say, and a lot of professors in this country, before they get tenure, feel like, oh my gosh, if I speak out in support of Palestinian freedom, if I sign that petition condemning Israel's bombing of Gaza, like, will I get tenure? I think there's a lot of fear there. Same for teachers and without sort of union protections and things like that. So I think there is an issue with self-censorship here. I think that's the goal of often these pro-Israel groups campaigns, because we do have robust, in theory, robust protections for freedom of speech here in the United States. But what happens in reality can often be different. But I think things are really changing. I think people are just really appalled and disgusted more than ever by what Israel's doing. And I think the tide is shifting. I mean, maybe I'm being overly optimistic here, but I think, going back to sort of what Ashraf said and mentioned about, the censorship not just being about like the state of Israel, but how it's happening with other authoritarian type governments, and in particular in India, right? So you had the Modi government pressuring Facebook to censor, people who are criticizing his handling of the COVID situation, right? And there was this hashtag resign Modi that was getting censored. I should just say my family's from India. So, and what do we see? We saw like a lot of employees from Facebook and also in Google being like, this is very problematic and pushing back against censorship, whether it's the right-wing, Modi government or the right-wing Netanyahu government, or really just these states' policies in general. And so I think that's something, there's something really exciting there. And I would like to see, more sort of regular people and staff who maybe don't consider themselves activists, but do care about basic human rights and dignity, speak out against these policies. And I think that could be an area where change happens. I can't remember your other questions, but I'll just stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I, as is typical for me, crammed too many questions into one. But no, I think that brings up a really important point, which is that, for better, for worse, kind of as Ashraf noted, the digital space is sort of where many contestations of power now take place, for better, for worse. And that's also where a lot of young people who are, teenagers, young people kind of learning about politics get their political education in many cases. So I think it brings up, there's some real cause for hope for, more freedom of information, availability of more information about human rights information, about Palestinians and other, kind of contested or suppressed narratives. But there's also cause for real concern about obviously the opposing powers to distract away or to take those narratives out of the picture. So kind of turning more to the policy lens and kind of bigger next steps. Mona, so Hamle has made a number of recommendations and I think submitted a number of petitions for consideration to the UN and other organizations about what types of policies might be taken or what types of policy steps might help to sort of correct or start to correct some of these problems, including an in-depth human rights investigation on the part of companies like Facebook and Twitter. Can you talk a bit more to some of the recommendations Hamle has made in this issue and sort of where you see the big priority or the first priority starting off?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to recommendations, Hamle is usually working on multi-level recommendations. We are working on recommendations for local civil society, for international and regional civil society, for the tech companies, and also for the third-party states. And I start basically with the tech companies' recommendations that we usually are pushing and are trying to influence their content moderation policies. I will start with the first thing that it's a must for us is having like a detailed transparency reports from these social media companies, because they usually say that we are publishing our regular transparency report, which is really vague. It's not giving us any kind of details. Sometimes we are comparing the numbers between the numbers that the cyber unit are issuing and the their transparency report has, and we find like there is a differences between what is here and what's there, and this is like a real obstacle for us, because sometimes the numbers from the social media companies are really less than the numbers that the Israeli cybercrime unit is issuing or is admitting that they applied and it was accepted from the social media companies. So and also we need to understand from this kind of detailed transparency report is where are you guys getting requests rather than the Israeli cyber unit, because that sometimes there is playing with trolls from act.il and other applications, sometimes from the Israeli cyber unit, but there is sometimes other parts of the government who are sending requests to the social media companies. So we need to understand how you receive this kind of requests and how you deal with that, the percentage that you are accepting, and why you accept this kind of thing. So the first of all, the detailed transparency report. And then a couple of months ago or earlier this year in March, Facebook has launched their human rights policy and the Palestine Digital Activism Forum, which is an annual forum we at Hamle working on. And like last month, we have observed a grave digital rights violations against us. And because of that, we are asking them to make a public audit for their content moderation policies and for their human rights policy that they announced and they published. If you are publishing a human rights policy, then you have to commit to that policy. And by observing and documenting what we documented, you know that your human rights policy is not really working. So let's make a public audit. Let's see where is the problem, and let's see how we can improve this kind of obstacles that we are facing, and let's see how we can also improve the content moderation policies that you already have, guys. And it's obviously it's biased, it's against Palestinians, and it's also discriminatory policies. On the other hand, we need to understand what is the dangerous organizations that you are talking about, because sometimes they are talking about the US Department of State list, the terrorist list, but sometimes we found new words and new organizations, and sometimes people are names of people are taken down, content is taken down based on specific words. So we need to understand what kind of words you are using to censor Palestinian content and how is being censored and so on. So this kind of thing should be clear for Palestinians, and for sure they should commit to co-design their policies with the Palestinian community and the Palestinian civil society, so they can adapt the context, the real context that we are living in, while we are living in a very complex reality under this settler colonialism. And we have this kind of censorship for our voices, and this tries to silence us in a systematic way and in a systematic manner. So all these recommendations we usually are rising to the social media companies. On the other hand, we usually also ask the third-party states to stand on the human rights principles, and also in the international law, and to pressure the social media companies to stick to the international law and to adapt the international law in their policies, because it seems they are not doing so. And by doing this discriminatory policies, they are violating the human rights principles and the international law. On the other hand, we usually ask the third-party states also to pressure the social media companies, for example, Facebook, and specifically Facebook Oversight Board, to be transparent about their decisions. As Ashraf said, part of the Oversight Board is the person who started the Israeli cyber unit, and by doing so, they are completely hiring people who were part of this oppressive regime. And we can never trust such decisions if they keep doing so and keep hiring such people. Much more than that, Jordana, she said clearly that I am the voice of Israel inside Facebook, and she was part of the justice minister in Israel, and they are hiring ex governmental people, and this is like obvious. will influence and will impact their content moderation policies. So this is like part of the recommendations, because the list is very long and we have many recommendations, but I highly recommend, if anyone wants to see the detailed recommendations, we have published last year in June a paper. It's called The Systematic Effort to Silence Palestinian Voices. They can see the full recommendations about that in this paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot to do, but I think you highlighted some of the most important first steps. Going to Ashraf, kind of as you brought up, these increasing numbers of employees at big tech companies starting to be more vocal and to speak out more about things that they disagree with. And I think there's more of a perspective about the internal steps that companies can take, including through, hiring policies, through things with HR, through more transparency in general. I guess going back to this larger question of what comes next or what can be done, do you have a perspective on what you would sort of deem, the most important, essential next step for these companies to take if you, were able to have the power to, sit down with Mark Zuckerberg like tomorrow? And how would this happen in the context of employees or former employees who have a lot of insider information and who are able to speak really, accommodatingly to how more diversity in hiring or more transparency in training, things like this, might lead to better outcomes? So what's your sense of sort of important policy levers in that domain?
I don't think there is like a one size fits all. I think what's happening in general with this case specifically to the Palestinians and other cases, I think we're seeing significant change happening and significant pressure points being at. I think according to the people that I know, the situation, the very charged, intense debates within Facebook, and I'm assuming other companies when it comes to their company's policies to the Palestinian issue is, I think, unprecedented. Some of my former colleagues tell me that the discussions were on the same level as Black Lives Matter, which for me is extremely remarkable, because Black Lives Matter in the US was extremely important. It was a very local issue within a US context. For an international context to be that important and that charged within a Facebook context, internal dynamics is quite remarkable. And I think in essence, it's going to continue further, because what we're seeing is, previously, all these tech companies had their echo chambers. They had what I call founders fan club. All of these guys are big fan club of the founder. They think they can do no wrong. They think that the founder is a god figure. But I think things are changing, because what we've seen over the past years, all of these companies have gone through significant cases of problems, challenges, different things, and specifically in the public eye. And that, to an extent, is chipping on the whole godly figure of the founder itself. And I think a lot of people are realizing we need to take stand, because these guys are extremely important within the context. These guys are extremely important because media is extremely important, and the inside guys are the most important people, because the best cases, the best things that we've read about over the past couple of years have been based on information coming from inside staffers. So I think that's the issue. I don't think there's an easy solution. Even if I sit with Mark, I think an easy solution would be for all companies to be extremely objective and just hold them in the line. I don't think that will ever happen, because at the end of the day, all of these companies are for profit. They operate in certain markets, unregulated spheres, and they want to continue to grow more. They want to continue to make more money. And the main threat for them to make money is government regulation. So they will not change. I don't expect any of these companies to change. I expect how we react to them, how we engage with them, how internal politics happen. And this year, when it comes, was quite remarkable. We're seeing activism in Facebook, in Google, in Amazon, in Apple. We've never seen that before. And I think what we're seeing is we're setting precedent. The next big thing that happens in India, China, or whatever else, we're going to see something that's going to be bigger. And I think that's the only thing that's keeping me optimistic.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think the antitrust and anti-monopoly kind of movement in the US we have maybe some hope for what might happen in the future, because I agree with you that that's going to be one of the main kind of policy levers to start challenging this. We have a little bit left here, and I want to go to Radhika and Mona. Just kind of indulge me, if you will. In like 2 sentences or less, if you got to sit down with Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, the tech CEO of your choice, deliver any message or any recommendation that you could in, a couple of sentences. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have as we close out. Radhika, let's go to you first.
Stop censoring Palestinians, stop censoring people speaking out for Palestinian freedom.
There you go. Yep. Mona, how about you?
Yeah, sure. I will tell him to stop silencing us and to stop complying with the oppressive regime. That's it.
Yeah, I think that sums it up very well. And I think I'm really grateful to all 3 of you for voicing the appropriate, cynicism balanced with the appropriate hope around this issue. And I hope our audience, I tried to follow some of the questions in the chat, and I think there's a lot to be said on this, and I hope we'll be able to continue this into future discussions. But yeah, I'm really grateful for our discussion today. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us, and to our 3 panelists for joining us today. And please keep in touch and stay safe, everyone.